presentations. We're going to go ahead and jump in. My name is Katrina Gamble, and I am the CEO of Sojourn Strategies, which is a social impact consulting firm that works with clients to drive advocacy campaigns, research, and their dollars in ways that move us closer to equity and justice. As part of that work, we are senior advisors to the Democracy and Power Innovation Fund, which you will hear a little bit more about now, and we help manage and advise on the narrative and identity portfolio at Democracy and Power Innovation Fund, which is how I met these amazing two people. So I'm gonna let them introduce themselves, and then we will jump into the panel. Really excited to be in conversation with Renata Robinson, the research director from New Georgia Project, the New Georgia Project Action Fund, as well as Terrence Woodbury, founding partner and CEO at HIT Strategies. So Renata, if you want to just take a second, introduce yourself, and then Terrence after that, and we'll jump into it.
Let's do it.
Sure. Hi, everyone. How are y'all today? Good. So I'm Renata Robinson with New Georgia Project Action Fund. We are an organization that focuses on amplifying, organizing, educating folks from historically marginalized communities, particularly Black ones, also young ones, queer ones, brown ones, et cetera, et cetera. And what we do is, on the research side, is to make sure that folks understand that Black people are not a monolith, and that we need segmentation like everyone else, right? You cannot talk to young Black voters in rural places the same way that you talk to, older Black voters in the heart of Atlanta. And I guess the thing that I want to just lift up is that we are one of the only organizations in Georgia that focuses on Black voter research, and we also focus on high opportunity voters, which we'll talk about later, but we don't use the term low propensity. We use high opportunity because we believe that those are folks that once engaged can make the difference in these elections.
Thank you for that.
Hello, everyone. Hello. My name is Terrence Woodbury. I am a founding partner at HIT Strategies. We're a full-service public opinion research firm that does polling, focus groups, social media listing, and every other way of understanding and uplifting the opinions of the voters that we believe are often underrepresented or misrepresented in research. A lot of the ways also forgive me, this is my fourth panel, and I am trying to sustain as much of this voice as possible. A part of the way that people of color are often underrepresented, just one example, a lot of the polling that we do is produced in crosstabs, these huge data sets of thousands and thousands of rows of data that we can cross-analyze. But oftentimes we'll see people of color are reduced to a single column in that crosstab, people of color, or even Black folks reduced to just Black men and Black women, and we understand that there is nuance and diversity in opinion, diversity of experience, and diversity of priorities. And until we are able to disaggregate and look deeper into these communities, we are in fact creating policy and messaging and programming that might be missing the very people that we hope to impact. And so that's what we want to talk more about and kind of just represent some of the many ways that we are creating that level of analysis.
All right, thank you. And before we jump into the substance of the panel, I wanted to play a little clip that frames a bit about what we're talking about, also the community in which we work together on this research, and then we'll jump into some more of the specific presentation.
73% of Black voters said they felt very powerful when they voted in 2020, and today that number has dropped to 43%. It's because the day after Election Day, they stopped hearing from politicians.
And with the sophisticated nature of our organizing and groups like ours. We've been at this since January 6th. Georgia voters know that their vote is powerful. Georgia voters know that the only way to neutralize the impact of these trash anti-voting bills is to show up in overwhelming numbers.
Listen up, Georgia. Remember that time we came out and turned Georgia blue for the first time since 1992? And then that time we came out again and got us our first black senator and our first millennial senator. In the same election? Yeah, we did. We want to acknowledge your work, your sacrifice, and your victories. Thank you, Georgia.
The Democracy and Power Innovation Fund, hosted at the Rockefeller Family Fund, is a community of organizers, researchers, and aligned funders with the goal of building a durable, progressive, multiracial democracy in the United States.
So I wanted to show that video for a couple of reasons. One, because it starts off with a discussion about power. And I know the title of our session is Combating Political Cynicism and Building Black Political Power. And that really is at the core of the research and the work that we do together. And as you heard at the end, the way in which we were all originally connected was through the Democracy and Power Innovation Fund, which is, as you just heard, is a community. It's a community of funders, organizers, researchers who are committed to shifting kind of politics as usual, research as usual when it comes to understanding our communities. The work is not just about how do we identify voters in a very transactional way and move them around in pawns to win a particular election, but as Renata and Terrence were saying, how do we, at the level of which people have poured curiosity into white communities, from soccer moms to Joe the plumber, really understanding the nuances, the values, and the interests of our communities in ways in which not only just like turns people out for elections, but can be used by organizing groups to actually build power and shift the way in which government and others like show up for our people. So that is like a little bit kind of grounding of like how we came into this work together. And I want to say two things on cynicism before I toss it to Renata and Terrence to add. I know we have that word in our title, and in part I want to say it's really important for us that we don't think of cynicism as this thing that's to be dismissed, or that people are unrightfully cynical. They're just cynical for reasons that don't make sense. Really, for the Black community and many other communities of color, that cynicism is based in reality. It's based in experiences of folks turning out for elections or other things and then not seeing real changes that to their communities. And folks showing up at the last minute in elections, treating people in very transactional ways. So in a lot of ways, that cynicism is based in reality. Sometimes we call it rightfully cynical. And so our work is not to dismiss that cynicism, but to understand it and try to figure out like, how do we tap into that, acknowledge it, and shift folks from being hopeless, acknowledging the cynicism, but also how do we use that in a way to like start messaging folks in ways to build power in our communities. And so I just wanted to like say that up front, and I wanted to toss it to both you, Renata, and Terrence. Obviously, Renata, through your work at NGP, as well as the research that you lead, direct relationship and engagement with folks in communities across the state of Georgia. Kind of your thoughts on this. How has this cynicism showed up in your work? Like, what does it look like? How does it impact how y'all thought about your civic engagement work at New Georgia Project?
Sure. So I think the first thing is that, and I say this all the time to funders, partners, everyone, we cannot start campaigning or start educating voters the summer before any election cycle. This is year-round, 365 days a week work, because it's not just about that election cycle. It is not just about electing a candidate. It is about connecting the dots for people and allowing them to see how the political process impacts the issues that they care about. And so with that, when people only hear from folks like at particular times every other year, it breeds more of the cynicism that's already there. Like it builds on to how they already feel, because instead of being a powerful civic player, they feel like, oh, you're just using me in this moment. And so part of the work that we do is making sure that people understand that there's always a place for them every single day when it comes to the political process and civic engagement. If there's not an election, there's always in Georgia, there's an opportunity to hold somebody accountable. There's always something to talk about, discuss, understand, write a representative about. There's always something, right? And so we, in New Georgia Project, make sure that we educate our folks about what's happening, and then also educate them about what they can do to impact it.
And Terrence, I want to ask you the same question. Obviously, you've talked to, I don't even know how many Black voters, people, done tons of research. Like, how is cynicism, like, how are you seeing it show up in your work? Like, what's the challenge you think it presents us as folks who are trying to move past that to build power?
Thank you for that, Katrina. You know, we often kind of couch all of our remarks and our analysis in the fact that these are not my opinions. I only share the opinions of the voters that we speak to. We conducted 200 focus groups last year, over 70 polls. That's well over 100,000 interviews. And so I'm only expressing what they hear, what I'm hearing from them in these rooms. And so the first thing I'll say about cynicism is that it's valid, right? This is not, you know, to Katrina's point, an invalid or displaced cynicism. And the other is that cynicism is not their problem. It's our problem, right? That they are not creating this cynicism, we are, with a inconsistent engagement. The way that we have seen that, you know, there are a couple of, every once in a while, I hear something in focus groups that just like takes me back, and I'm like, shit, that was so good. I'm gonna have to like run and tell that. And so I'm here to tell that. You know, it was a young man in Florida right before the 2020 election who said to me, my hood ain't get no better under Obama, it ain't get no worse under Trump. And so what do any of these presidents got to do with me? That is a realism of his lived experience, that for those closest to the pain, alternating who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue ain't affecting that pain. It ain't making it any better, it ain't making it any worse. And then the other, this is when I get frustrated at their frustration, right? It's like, God, look at what we have done. Look at what we've created. It is when I ask a room of young voters in Philadelphia, well, what would make you think that any of this matters? What would make you think that these elections impact you? And they say, well, if they would just address this and that X and Y and Z, if I would hear them talking about this issue and that issue, if I would hear them, if I saw progress on this issue and that issue, and then I hand them a list of the progress that has been made, child tax credits and banning no-knock warrants and banning chokeholds and, you know, federal registry of misconduct, and the things that you all just demanded are happening. And they shake their head, and they're getting more frustrated and more angry. And I'm like, well, if the progress isn't, how's the progress making you more frustrated? And it's because they can't access any of it. What he said to me was, well, you know, my sister just got evicted. She couldn't access these child tax credits on this list. And these housing vouchers you're talking about, I don't know anybody that got them. And so when the progress is inaccessible to them, when we come back along and tell them how much progress we're making that they couldn't access, we are deepening that cynicism. And so that's a part of what we have to do, is both not just change the message. I always say it's not about a message that's making their lives better. First, we have to make their lives better.
Absolutely.
Right on. Absolutely. And all of this about this idea around cynicism and how it can really breed frustration, hopelessness, all these things. In the clip that we showed at the start, Terrence, you were saying how in Georgia in 2020, people, like 70% of Black voters felt powerful. So there is like a way to shift past all of this. And so I want if you could just talk a little bit about some of the research, like what are some of the learnings of like, how do we not get stuck in that? Like what's the, to your point, right? A lot of this is on us, like what's the work for us to do to actually like shift that cynicism?
Yeah. When we talk about this, the correlations between perceptions of power, it's weird because I'm like trying to see what slide we're on and make sure where we're at. But when we talk about perfect. All right, here we are. All right. So in Georgia, right, I always think Georgia is such a good prototype for the nation. Listen, give a round of applause to the work that's been done in Georgia. And it was it's in partnership with Renata that I'm like, a part of what we have to do here is acknowledge them as the hero. It is not John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock that turned Georgia blue.
Absolutely.
Those two candidates did not turn Georgia blue. If it was not for the overwhelming work of organizers like New Georgia Project and then sacrifices of these voters. And so that's how we end up with an ad that says, you remember when we did it? You remember when you did it? We are here to acknowledge you and your progress. And so, we have to, when you look at the way that perceptions of power, I think if we go to the next slide even, we have actually, I'll come back to that. Actually, let's do this. So, we start talking about, we talk about the variation, the diversity within the Black political experience. And so a lot of that is seen through the gender and the generation gap. There's a bunch of bars on here. In that gray box, you'll see the gender gap, where men are voting at much lower levels than women. The first thing you'll see here is that is true of every single race. That is not unique to Black people, right? The gender gap, across every single race, women vote more than men. That is a fact. But what is also true is that it is more concentrated amongst Black folks, and that there's a 12-point gap between Black women's turnout and Black men's turnout. I want to be clear that is not Black men's problem. That is our problem. Again, cynicism is not their fault. It is our fault. And so, I often say, like, our policies and our candidates are the product. The voters are the consumer. When folks stop buying Coca-Cola, you don't blame the consumer. You look at the product and you make that product more appealing to the consumer. And so we have to close that gender gap by making our product, our policies, our candidates, our party, if we are outside of a C3 conversation, more appealing to Black men. But it's also true generationally. The generation gap is also true across all voters. Older voters vote more than younger voters across all races. But again, it is more concentrated amongst Black voters because of that cynicism that we have to continue to address. And here, this is where what that first ad was referencing. On this first slide, you'll see the correlation. You'll see a question that we ask. Regardless of how often you vote, how much power does your vote have to make a difference in your community? The reason we ask this question is because we've measured and observed a direct correlation between perceptions of power and vote likelihood. Oftentimes you will hear, and I like to point to how other polling is just missing the mark on our communities, where you often hear enthusiasm measures. Mm-hmm. How enthusiastic are you to vote in the upcoming election? Well, again, it was in a focus group where a Black man told me, I don't vote enthusiastically. He said, voting for me is like taking out the trash. I don't want to do it, but if I don't do it, it's going to start to stink around here. I was like, damn, that's good. I'm going to have to run tell that. And so you see, we start, instead of asking enthusiasm, we started asking power. And it becomes not only a good baseline and metric point, it becomes the shift metric. All of our efforts are in the effort of increasing self-perceived power, not just the likelihood that you'll tell us that you'll vote or the likelihood that you'll tell us that you'll vote for this candidate. It is increasing your self-perceived power. And so at the bottom, and so you'll see there, 73% of Black voters in 2020 said they felt extremely powerful. 73%, almost direct correlation. Well, 2 years later, that power had dropped by 30 points. I could tell you right now, and Renata knows better than anybody in here, if black participation dropped in Georgia by 30 points, it's no longer a blue state, it ain't even a purple state. And so when we went back into focus groups and asked them, why'd you feel so powerful in 2020 and why do you feel so less powerful now? They said, well, in 2020, we were getting text every day, not just from Stacey Abrams, but from Stacey and from Brian Kemp, from Nathan Deal and from John Ossoff. You know, they were being courted. They were being solicited. They were also being informed. They knew what was going on. Listen, these text messages are annoying as hell and they work. It is effective. They pull out their phones and literally read them to me. I'm like, y'all, don't stop texting them. We should be texting them. So during the election, you know, we texted every day, click here to access your ballot, and click here to find your polling place, and click here to sign this pledge that you're going to vote. Well, after the election, they need to click here to access these jobs that have been created by the infrastructure bill. They need to click here to see that legislation that's moving through the Georgia state legislature to make it harder for them to vote. Click here to apply pressure to your senator to make sure that they don't sign that bill that's going to be on the docket tomorrow. That's how we keep them engaged year-round, and I promise y'all, a text message once a week is a whole lot cheaper than $100 million on TV in Georgia in the last 30 days.
And they do not opt out.
That's right.
They complain, but they don't opt out.
That's exactly right.
They don't even delete them half the time.
And so at the bottom there, you'll see this cycle of power that so much of our political power is only based in electoral power, right? That your power to elect the representatives that you want. Well, that's the first stage of political power. You also have negotiating power. Once they're elected, you have the power to move them closer to your agenda. You also have, what's the next one? Accountability power. That once you've elected them and once you've negotiated with them, if they're still not doing what you want, you get to hold them accountable. We also call that protest power. That's when you show up and start making noise. And then finally, and this is the one that's often the most appealing, especially to cynical voters, you got punitive power to fire their asses when they don't do what you've asked, what you've negotiated and protested and solicited them to do. And so that is a broader cycle of power that keeps them in far after they've casted their vote.
Right. I want to ask you a follow-up question on this, Terrence, so both Renata and you, in your opening remarks, right, we're talking about this idea that if we're really interested in this, one, about how do we build power within the Black community, how do we increase people's perceptions of power, you can't talk to the older Black voter in the center of Atlanta the same as like the young Black man who's living in, I don't know, Savannah or whatever, some other place outside of Atlanta. And you talked about the kind of generational and age and gender, but we know that the nuances aren't always so clear.
That's right.
Cut about just by race, just by gender and age. And so if you could also just talk a little bit more about how we start to look at other ways in which understanding these intersections within the African American community. And before you kind of jump in and explain that, I would love, Renata, for you to just talk about, from your work, like an organizing, power building organization, like why that is like so important for y'all.
Yeah, so a great example was leading up to the January 2021 runoffs. So we kept seeing all these posts that showed. So Terrence already said the youth vote turnout rate is always low, or lowish, lower than everybody else. Let's say it that way. But all of the posts were showing that the youth vote in rural Georgia was far and away lower than anything we had ever seen. It was like a 30% likelihood of them to vote. And so we worked with HIT to conduct some focus groups specifically of young people in rural Georgia. So we need to understand what is happening here, because this was significant. What we heard them say was, the candidates sound great, but we won't believe them until they actually get in office and do something. They said, these are the issues that I care about. I have very low confidence that it's going to happen.
That's right.
And so we did some message testing during those focus groups. And what we found was this choice frame that we keep utilizing. When you redirect and say, okay, this is what you want, here are the choices. Now, these candidates have at least promised that they would move. So what did these voters care about? They cared about racial justice, criminal justice. They wanted to see George Floyd Justice Policing Act passed. They wanted the stimulus check. So remember, we were still in the midst of the height of COVID. They wanted some more stimulus checks. And so from there, again, you have two candidates who promised to do their part to make it happen, and you have two candidates who have promised to block it. And
demonstrate it. Two candidates that are in the U.S. Senate right now that have demonstrated their opposition to your agenda.
Yes. And so our thing was, if this is something that matters to you, you have to do something, because doing nothing ensures that what you want to see happen will not happen. And so from there, we created ads. Now, remember, these were young people in rural Georgia that we cared about. So when we created those ads, we didn't have somebody from our Atlanta office doing the voiceover. We didn't have, the beautiful Atlanta skyline in the background. We went to their communities. We filmed people that they could recognize. We had our field office leads who had their accent, their way of speaking, talking to them, because we wanted them to know this is for you. We're not applying something that we created for somebody else and just running it down there. This is for you because you matter, so that they can see themselves in those ads. And we're talking about the things that we know you care about. And I truly believe that is one of the things that made the difference in January 2021, because that turnout rate increased. Because it's no longer about, well, I don't think they'll do anything about it. It's, here's what I want, and here's the best path to get there. And so with that, we have to make sure that we are not talking to the proverbial black person in the black belt. We have to identify who we're talking to and understand what they care about, so that we can actually talk to them in a way that is meaningful to them. Because it's not about us, it's about reaching them.
Right on. Yeah, now Terrence, if you could share a little bit about some of the learnings from the research that will help us do more of this nuanced targeting and outreach and communication with folks.
Absolutely. Before I go into how we disaggregate and better understand the black community, I want to give one more example from Georgia, because I think it's so emblematic of the gap of information that we don't see in a lot of other places. Voting rights is not a top 5 issue for most voters of color. It's not even a top 10 issue for most voters of color, seriously. Because people only think about their access to voting when they're trying to vote. So today, voting rights is not a thing that most folks that are not in rooms like this are concerned about every day, until they go and try to vote, and it's harder than it was last time. But it's also, because of the work that we've done during COVID, it has gotten increasingly easier for most people to vote. We've made mail-in ballots more accessible and drop-off boxes more accessible, and because of those things, the urgency of voting rights is just not as real on our side of the aisle as much as voting fraud is urgent on the other side, right? The one exception to that in the whole country is Georgia. In Georgia, voting rights is a top 3 issue. It's a top 3 issue today. It was a top 3 issue before the election. It's a top 3 issue after the election. You know why? Constant communication. They never stop talking to them about it. And so when I'm in focus groups and I ask them, well, why is voting rights so important to you? And these are, high opportunity, low propensity, voted once in the last 3 elections. And they say, well, it's because of SB 207. I'm making up the number now because I'm not. 202. See, I was close. See, I'm not on the New Georgia Project text list, or else I would have known the number.
Right.
Because I got these voters telling me, well, it's because SB 202 is working his way through Congress, and what we really need is Coca-Cola and Delta to apply pressure. And I'm like, they talking about corporate responsibility, y'all. They not just talking about voting folks. We trying to get to the electoral power. Remember the first step. That's what we trying to get to. They done moved all the way through negotiations and accountability, and they damn near the punitive. And that's a different, and I'm like, so how are you hearing about SB 202? And he pull out his phone and read me a text message from New Georgia Project that he got last week. 6 months before an election, 6 months after an election, he's still getting text messages from New Georgia from New Georgia Project. And that's what this constant communication, that power never ceases, never begins to diminish when they are constantly engaged and when they know what's going, when they feel informed and when they know what they can do to change the outcomes. So let's disaggregate beyond, I told you about the gender and the generation gaps. To Katrina's point, we know that is an inadequate way of understanding diversity in the Black community. Just because you know that Black men and Black women are different don't mean that you understand Black men. Because guess what? They also different from each other. And so we've started to try and figure out these values clusters. What are the shared values that can help us better understand groups of Black voters in order to better communicate? And what we've come up with are 5 distinct clusters. 5 distinct clusters that begin to align and organize these values. The first 2 you see here are the most democratic clusters within the Black electorate. The 30% of Black voters fall in, this is the largest cluster, they fall in this legacy civil rights group. I often say that Black seniors are my favorite voters because you know that they're going to vote and you know who they're going to vote for. Well, a lot of those Black seniors are in this very first cluster. They are age 50 plus. They are the strongest and most partisan Democratic voters, and they are really the anchor of the Democratic coalition. The second is this more emerging cluster. This is the aspirational activists. Only 13% of Black folks fall in this cluster, but they are younger, they are more likely to be women. This is also the highest income and education cluster. And they are also very strong Dems. They're also more likely to be participating to offset injustice, right? Whether that's reproductive justice or criminal justice or racial justice, that they are often more motivated by justice frames. And then these next 2 clusters are where I think we have the most work to do. The first is this next gen optimists. They are also a millennial and Gen X cluster. They are a little bit less educated, a little bit less engaged, but this is why we call them optimists, because this is the cluster that will report that they vote in every election, and they actually aspire to vote in every election. This is the same cluster that would tell me in focus groups in Detroit, when I ask them, like, how often do you vote? They say every time if there's an election I'm voting in. And I say, well, why didn't you vote last week in that Democratic primary? And now they are pissed off that they had no idea there was a Democratic primary. Mm-hmm. That wasn't a choice not to vote. They were not informed. And they were pissed off that they missed it. That's why they're the optimists, right? They are very sporadic participation, but it ain't because they want to participate sporadically. It's because they don't have the information. The next is what we call the rightfully cynical. This is a group that is very cynical towards both parties, very cynical towards the system. They have made a choice to withdraw. They have seen the inefficacy of voting and have withdrawn from that process. This is the youngest, by far the youngest cluster, mostly Gen Z. They are also, this is why we say rightfully cynical, they are also the closest to the pain. Lowest education, lowest income. And oftentimes, like we said, those closest to the pain are just not feeling the progress that we are making. That's this group here. Now let me show you something really interesting. This is C3, so I'm gonna be careful how I talk about these next 2 groups. Because that last one there, this race-neutral conservative, right? There's only 7%, smallest cluster. We know most black folks ain't Republican, but 7%, most likely to be men, most likely to be middle-aged men, very favorable towards Republicans, towards GOP, towards Donald Trump. But here's what's interesting. While only 7% of black folks fall in this cluster, Republicans are getting 17, 18, 19% of black votes in a recent election. How is that if only 7% are conservatives? It's because they are tapping into those cynics. How many of us remember Donald Trump standing on stage and saying, "What you got to lose"? Who was he talking to? Those cynics. And it's working.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we talk about this research and you present it and I look at it, the rightfully cynical category is just, it feels like such a gut punch. And I don't know if you said this, but it's on the slides, like 29%. That's right. It's like the second largest after the civil rights legacy cluster, right? Which generally, that's when people are just doing blanket, monolithic messaging. That's who they're talking to. And those are people who are already going to vote anyway.
That's right. That's right.
So it's like such an issue, and to your point, it's actually like really kind of shifting, it could potentially shift the political landscape in real ways. And then also the next gen optimists, it's like, those are the people that, like, if people just showed up and actually talked to them, to your point, Renata, right, of high opportunity voters, right? They're excited, they want to vote, they have a strong sense of community and connection, but people aren't giving them the information to actually exercise it, and that they're 21%. That's so right. they're this.
That's half the electorate right there.
Yeah, like 2 and 3 after like legacy civil rights, and so those, it's like we got work to do, I guess, is the point. The point of that. And so with that, I wanted to ask Terrence, before we kind of hear from Renata about like how this research has actually got applied in program, if you could talk a little bit about what are some of like the messages or like ways in which we can actually talk to some of these voters that are up here on the values clusters.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at those next gen optimists, those rightfully cynical, because I agree with Katrina, that's where the overwhelming amount of our efforts should be. I'm tempted to say all of it. All of our resources should be going to inform, educate, and mobilize those two groups. It's half of the electorate are in those two groups right there, and they're the most inconsistent voters. But remember what I just told you about these two groups, right? Once we were able to disaggregate this way, we now understand that it's not the same intervention.
No.
One of them don't need to be persuaded, they need to be informed. Here's the upcoming elections, here's the upcoming, legislation coming through, coming down the docket, and if they knew what was happening, they would engage. They want to engage. But just telling the rightfully cynics when the next election is, just a flat-out mobilization message is going to fall flat because they have made a decision that this don't work for them. And so there's a difference between, when we remember those like types of power that we talk about. Well, this punitive power and this accountability power and this protest power, that's really effective for the next gen optimists. But for the rightfully cynics, they are going to need, these are persuasion voters, right? Just a pure mobilization message, the GOTV message is not going to work for a voter that needs to be persuaded that this shit even matters. And once we understand the electorate that way, we are now putting together very different interventions, very different messages, very different text messages, right? We're saying that everybody on this list needs to be getting a text message once a week, but it ain't the same message.
Right on.
Yes, okay. So, yeah, okay. See, if I want to see these slides. All right, so there's a couple of things that we have to do here. One, progress equals power. Last panel. I'm going to leave the rest of my voice right here on this stage. So progress equals power. Again, we have to connect them to that progress and not just tell them about it after it's done. If we just tell them about it and they can't access it, it's going to piss them off, especially those rightfully cynics. It is enforcing their cynicism. See, look, government works for everybody but people like me. And so the progress equals power for them. These are the folks we have to make their lives better. This is the text message they need is click here, to access housing vouchers that were made available by the CARES Act. Click here to access jobs that were made available by the infrastructure. The second is that we must change the hero of the story. We have to make them the hero of the story. You saw the ad that Katrina played earlier. That's not just a message about them being the hero. Yeah, we want to say thank you for child tax credits to the voters of Georgia, because if it wasn't for those 2 senators, the rest of the country wouldn't have had it. And so we want to acknowledge that, but it also means changing the messenger, that they were the actual voice in the message. And the last thing here is that the power has to go far beyond Election Day, and that's how we take them through the full cycle of power.
Right on. And we've been talking a lot about the data and the research, and obviously research that's not used is not useful. So Renata, I'm really excited to turn over to you to talk about how you all have actually used this research in your work at NGP, and like how it's like impacted your program there.
Sure. So you saw a piece of this Thank You Georgia ad, but for context, the reason that ad was so important was because we made history on January 5th, and then on January 6th, terrorists shat on the Capitol walls.
Come on.
So we never got a chance to celebrate that historical turnout. So let's be clear, it's not just about the win. So what we know from our research is that political power for Black people is not electing Black people. It's not even electing Democrats. It is seeing the investments in our communities. It is actually seeing that someone is working on our behalf. And so the historical turnout, that was the win. People showing up to say what they wanted was the win, and we never got to celebrate. And so we put this ad together to make sure that folks were connecting their personal vote with all the progress that we've seen.
Georgia, remember that time we came out and turned Georgia blue for the first time since 1992? And then that time we came out again and got us our first Black senator and our first millennial senator in the same election? Yeah, we did. We want to acknowledge your work, your sacrifice, and your victories. Thank you, Georgia, because without you showing up and showing out, things would be a lot different. Because of you, we got stimulus checks, expanded child care resources, investments in HBCUs, an infrastructure plan that's going to expand broadband coverage and get our households and child care centers safe drinking water, and so much more. And we couldn't have done it without you, but we're not done yet. There's more fights and more victories ahead. So we are wound up. We're coming from the ground up, so turn the sound up. We're in this together. Mount up.
So what we know leading into 2024 is that we have a PR problem. Folks don't know what has happened. And so part of that, we're trying to right now raise the funds to do another Thank You Georgia project where we're doing an updated version of this, but also some other tactics so we can really drive home, like, no, we have not seen all of the progress that we wanted to see, but we are not in the place that we would have been had they not shown up in 2021. This next slide, so in the same focus group that Terrence and I talked about after the 2020 elections, we did an experiment to see if information itself could be persuasion, and we found that yes, it could. Just by telling voters what the governor does that impacts them. So it's the governor that decides how much money goes to your community. It's the Secretary of State who decides who gets purged off the voter rolls. It's the agricultural commissioner that ensures you have fresh food in your local grocery store. Just by tying the position, no candidate information, no nothing, but here's what those offices do, made a difference in their likelihood to vote. And so with that, we had Ready, Set, Vote. It was a website The voters could go to, put their address in, it would pull up their ballot, and first they could see, what do these positions do? Why do we care that this is on the ballot? And then from there, they could go and look at the different candidates, what those candidates said on the record about different issues. They could then fill out the ballot, screenshot it, print it out, take it to the polls. One of the things, so last year we did 4 different statewide polls throughout the year, and every single time in the top barriers were, I don't know enough about the candidates, I don't think that my vote will change the things that matters to me, and I don't like the candidates. Now, there's not much we can do about I don't like the candidates, but we can absolutely help them make sure that they understand who is on that ballot and why they should care. And we can also reinforce that they actually can make a difference on those things that matter to them. Okay, so in our work, we also want to make sure that we are responding in real time. So of course, you know, sometimes research takes a long time. But when Roe v. Wade was overturned, we had to do something, right? But the issue was, we kept hearing from these mainstream organizations that focus on white voters about the messaging that we should use, and I just kept saying, y'all, I just don't think that Black people in Georgia want to hear that. And so we did focus groups. We did one that was for young Black women. We did one that was older Black women over 55. We did one that was LGBTQ people. And we did one that was for Black men. And what we learned is that they support abortion access. The issue, though, was that it's not the only thing related to reproductive health care that they cared about. And so when you only focus on abortion, it's very reductive to them, because they're thinking about maternal mortality. They're thinking about the lack of sex education. They're thinking about access to birth control. They're thinking about all these other issues. And so if we want to talk about abortion, we first have to bring them in by acknowledging all of these things that are missing. And so from that, we were able to create a voter guide where we talked about those issues, and we talked about the positions on the ballot that could influence those issues that we saw pertinent to reproductive justice. Black men. People say they care about Black men, but but then you start looking at the investments, and what happens is, just like with quote-unquote low propensity voters, if funders, organizations, et cetera, don't see a certain ROI, they just say, forget it, right? Well, we are not that. We believe, like, our theory of change is we can move folks that other folks don't think can be moved. Mm-hmm. And so we've done a lot of research on Black men, but we go to where they are. We've done focus groups inside of barbershops. So back up to the reproductive justice focus groups. The Black man focus group was so pivotal simply because they were like, no one ever asked us.
That's right.
No one ever asked us what we thought about reproductive justice. Do you know at the end of that focus group, of course, you know, you ain't gotta go, but you gotta get out of here. They were standing in the parking lot still talking about reproductive justice.
I love that.
And so when we talk about cynicism, a lot of it is simply people not feeling heard or seen or cared about. Just simply asking them how they feel can make such a difference. And so we've gone into these places, we've done message testing and all these different things, and what we know about Black men is, one, they care about generational progress. And so if we can create the imagery of the baton has been passed to you, and now you have to get into a place where you can then pass the baton to your children and grandchildren, they're more willing to listen to you because that is a vision that they care about. They don't want to be the people that we're blaming because a certain candidate did not win. They don't want people in the media talking about the difference between black men and black women. It creates the discord. That's the conversation that makes them disengaged. I was talking this morning about disinformation, and one of the themes, narratives that I keep hearing is that black men don't vote, or that black men won't vote for this particular candidate. And one of the things the New Georgia Project did was not only push back against that narrative in our communities and celebrate our black men, but we also talked to reporters and showed them the data that Terrence presented. Yes, there's absolutely a gap between black men and black women, but let's be clear that black men still had a higher percentage of men across other races. That's right. That's nothing to sneeze at. So let's be clear that when there's a narrative, it does not have to be true. And so we have to push back to make sure that we're empowering the people who we absolutely do need to show up and vote.
Thank you both. I think we're at time, almost at time. So I want to just move to any closing comments. I mean, for folks who are, which we all should be, right? Folks who are moving work and research around engaging Black folks, not just around elections, but to the point of building power. What are some of the kind of key takeaways you want to leave folks with?
So, of course, you have to disaggregate, stop thinking about, when you think about what is the Black message, there isn't one because there's not a Black voter. There's several Black messages that need to be directed to the types of voters that are going to resonate, that they will resonate with. We need to expand the cycle of power beyond just electoral power. First of all, we need to start talking about electoral power and not just the transaction of if you vote, you get this. But there's a power that you have, and that not using it doesn't mean it's not there. You still have that power. And then finally, use research to inform these programs and policies, because if we don't understand the attitudes of the people that we're trying to communicate with, then we could be potentially doing them a disservice.
Right on.
I would add to that, we have to stop talking at people and talk with people. I think the reason the New Georgia Project is able to engage with so many people is that we're curious. We don't knock on the door and just assume that whatever we're talking about is important to them. We ask people, what's on your mind today? What's your top concern? What's happening in this community? So that we're allowing them to some degree to guide the conversation. But also, we just have to make sure that we are investing in people, again, year-round. We have to do this work in a way that we are not assuming that there are people that we can throw away. Black voters are absolutely what we need, right? Especially in a place like Georgia where elections are won on the margins, we cannot count Black people out. Not over a third of the population. And so with that, we all have to continue talking to our funders, talking to our partners, talking to whoever will listen about the power of those who have been marginalized. So we're talking about Black people today, but there are many communities where we have to continue making sure that folks understand it is not just about white voters. It is about all of us. And together, we can make the difference, even in a place like Georgia.
Right on. I feel like that's it. What else should I say? We cannot count Black voters out, right? That was the takeaway. And also that we need to understand the nuances within our community. So I think we're at time. I was going to try to take questions, but I think we're at time. So really appreciate folks showing up. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.